Safe Harbor Conversations, engaging heart, mind, and soul. Our conversation topic today: why this faith? Our conversationalists are Reverend Eugenia Gamble, pastor and author, Wink Farron, pastor, social media shepherd, and life coach. And I'm Tom Cochran, a journalist, analyst, and a Presbyterian elder. These are challenging times for people of faith, for churches, organized religion, faith groups. Seems to be a very acrimonious time. Membership is declining in a lot of denominations around the world. It appears as though some would seek to hijack Christian faith and turn it into a political tool. There is a rise in the nones and dones, those who have no faith affiliation or say they do not, or have been active and no longer are. So, we're going to try and unpack some of that today by looking at our interpretation of this faith we follow, the Christian faith. Why this faith? We're glad that you're along for this conversation. Let's start with Eugenia Gamble. Eugenia, why this faith?
Yeah, I didn't want to go first, but I will because I'm happy to talk about my faith. My faith is the center of my life, and it has been as long as I can remember. My earliest memory, my entire earliest memory, when I was 2.5 years old, is a deeply spiritual memory. And it surrounded the death of my grandmother. My grandmother and I were very close to each other, and she died from out of control diabetes. And in those days, and this would have been in the 50s, and in those days in Alabama, many of the funerals were held from home. And that the family decided that that's how we would do my grandmother's funeral. And it was also decided that I was too young to stay for that. There was going to be the casket brought in front of the fireplace in the living room just behind me. And they thought that, and it would be open. And so they thought that I was not ready for that. And so I was taken across the street to my cousin's house. And this is where my memory becomes so vivid. I remember crossing the busy street, holding onto the hand of a cousin who must have been older, because I remember having to hold like this to hold that hand. And when we crossed the street, I turned back and looked at the house I'm sitting in right now. And I saw the mourners coming up the steps and in their black suits, and the women in their black suits and their gloves and their little hats with the veils over their eyes. And I remember watching them coming into the house and seeing suddenly this kind of bright golden aura around the house. And it was strange looking. It was spiky looking, kind of like the crown on the Statue of Liberty. And it was pulsating a little bit, this clear, beautiful, bright, sparkling aura all around the house. And I didn't wonder at it. It didn't frighten me. I remember, this is such a profound memory. I remember knowing at age 2.5 that was God, that God was here to comfort our family, that aura was the arms of God around our house, and that my grandmother, that I called Mom, my mother was Mama and grandmother was Mom, and that Mom was fine, and that it was all going to be all right. And after I saw that, I had that vivid memory. Then I just, I went into the house with my cousin and played with the new electric train set. So there's never been a time in my life when I have not been aware of some divine presence. And, there have certainly been times in my life when I chose to act as if that were not the case. But that's never not been present for me. There have been moments in my life when there have been steps taken that have made the faith riper for me. Growing up in the revival culture of the Deep South, people would always ask you when you were saved. And I would say I was saved on the cross, but there was that moment in which the faith of my baptism became my own. And I can tell you the date of that is May 13th, 1969. I was at a big youth group meeting, and that sparkly presence was there. And I knew that somehow I wanted to make the journey more deliberately my own. And, it was 15 years later, I think, to the day that I was ordained as a pastor. But at any rate, I think my experience of the faith, I didn't come to it from a point of kind of intellectual assent to a set of beliefs. Although I was imprinted with those beliefs, and I'm pretty orthodox in them to this day. But I came to faith and journey in faith as an experiential reality. And I experience the divine presence in all of the different ways. I've always been a bit of a mystic, let's face it, a bit of a prophet as well. But I experience divine presence in so many of the different ways that the scriptures talk about. I experienced that, what I call the aura, the Shekinah. The Old Testament talks about that as the loving, intimate presence of God with the people. I experienced that as paternal. A lot of people have trouble with the father imagery of God because they have not had positive fathering. I did. I had exquisite fathering from my human father. And so those paternal images of care come to me in times of trouble or times when even my faith seems to be wavering. I've told the story a number of times of a time not too many years back, maybe 20 years back. When you're 71, that's not too many years. The time when I had been in the hospital and had surgery on my neck, my first surgery on my neck, and it had gone bad. And I coded and had to be, rushed back into surgery. But I quit breathing. And as that was happening, I knew I was having trouble. But as that was happening, I called for help. I was still in the hospital. I called for help, and they came in thinking I was having an asthma attack and stuff. And at the moment when I could no longer sustain breath, at that moment when spirit, wind, breath, ruach, could not come into me, I heard them call the code and say, "We're losing her, call the code." And everything went to black. And when I was resuscitated on the operating table to find out, if there'd been brain damage from the lack of oxygen, when I was resuscitated again on the operating table, I remember seeing the light, those huge lights in the operating table, and seeing the light and kind of taking in this in-breath, this in-spiritus, this inspiration, this inspiring breathing of the spirit. And so what was supposed to be like a week-long recuperation turned into about a 3-month recuperation. And I got very depressed. For one of the few times in my life, I went into a very dark place. Because in that moment when they called the code and I couldn't breathe in spirits, I expected, this was in the days of Touched by an Angel. I expected a good-looking angel in a pink coat and, all that kind of light and wonderment and everything. And it was darkness. It was awful. And so I had a kind of faith crisis. And in the course of it, I was home here in this very room. And at one point, my dad, who was not a man of many words, but he noticed things. And at one point he noticed, and he just came in and he sat on the foot of the bed here and he said, he called me Clunk, which is a story for another day. He said, "Clunk, what is the matter with you?" And I told him everything. I said, how can I told him about that darkness, that blackness. And I said, how can I climb into the pulpit again when I've had this experience of nothingness at dying? And he said something that made me so mad. He said, well, what makes you think you're better than Jesus? And I was truly mad at that. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, it seems to me that he had that same experience on the cross. Why have you abandoned me? And he said, maybe it's just part of it. And when he said that, and I felt that identification with Jesus, when that paternal love helped me identify with the Christ that I have longed to follow and worked to follow all of my days, it was like a burst of light. And I experienced a kind of solidarity with the crucified Christ that I had never experienced before, even in hardship, in my privileged kind of life. So that sense of, paternal care and of solidarity with Christ has a spiritual component, but it also has the component of, it has an intellectual component as well, because in the identification that I kind of have walking with Jesus, I think of Word, and the Word as the interiority of God's values displayed in Christ. And so that's part of why the language of Scripture is so enthralling to me, because I know those words capture the interiority of Christ. And lately I've been learning a little bit of Aramaic, the language that Jesus actually spoke. I've been studying the Beatitudes in Aramaic, and I learned that when he talks about blessedness in Aramaic, that means to be right, and cursedness means to be unright, not at the right place, not at the right time, not ready. And righteousness means to have internal honesty that results in external justice. So those are the themes of my life that are also the themes of my faith. And which came first, the chicken or the egg? Did my faith implant those themes in me, or did my life open me to those themes of faith? I don't know for sure. So I don't really know how to help people who have never had any experience of divine presence, except to try to point them to their moments of ecstasy, their moments of magnificence, their moments of wonder, and then begin to kind of unpack those moments to see them as divine encounters. So why this faith? I don't have a choice. It's just, it is.
Well said. And I want to come back and touch on a couple of things that you said, and we will circle back on this. But that's a powerful story, sister. Thank you. Wink, it's my understanding that you were born into faith, or born into a family of faith and service.
Yeah. As I've found, though, missionary kids and pastors' kids are some of the worst in the church for bad behavior. I mean, just being born with parents who understand what the gospel is doesn't mean it rubs off on you. But I wasn't a terrible kid, but I grew up seeing stuff happen. I grew up in the Philippines, so my parents were missionaries there. I was born in Sri Lanka, and grew up in the Philippines and saw all kinds of things. I mean, for some reason, when you're overseas, there's less of a veil between the supernatural and the natural, and I don't know why that is. But I mean, you see stuff right out in front when it comes to the spiritual world. And so I grew up seeing miracles, a lot of miracles. I grew up seeing demon possession. I grew up seeing people come to Christ in radical ways. I remember one man that that came to Christ, and he was a Hindu fire walker. I don't know if you've ever seen those guys, but they do all kinds of crazy things to persuade people to follow that religion, and including walking on coals of fire. And I mean, it's not like here in the States when they do that fire walk and they just kind of run across it. I mean, they walk out into the middle of it and sit down, and it's all those hot coals. And you go, how in the world? And it's basically, I guess, demon shielding them from getting burned. But it is very persuasive. But this fellow came to Christ, and he realized, and I saw this just miraculous transformation in his life. He became a pastor of a church of 5,000. To see that before and after. And so I saw all that, and yet, went to the denominational college, became a minister of music in the first church, and then later on became a youth pastor in a couple churches later. And it was in 1981 where I was challenged by a member of the congregation. They just came into my office and said, do you really know what you're talking about? Because he had seen something in me that he wanted to challenge me on. I said, what do you mean? Do you really know who Jesus Christ is? Are you a true follower of Jesus Christ? Well, of course I am. I grew up in this. I know this. And he said, I don't think you do. I just don't think you do. Well, I've seen miracles. Well, I just don't think you do. His name was Jerry. And he got me to thinking. And I went to his Sunday school class because at that time we were a young couple, and it was the young couples class. And he would always talk about the gospel and the presence of Jesus Christ in a person's life, and how it just, what Christ had done reorders your whole way of thinking. And I thought, well, he's right on all these points. I don't. And finally, I challenged him. I said, Jerry, I've got notes from your class. I'm going to write a test for the people in the class to take to see if what you're saying is sticking with them. And he says, good. I welcome that. I hope they are. And so as I was going through these points, I began seeing where I was coming up short, you know? And I looked at it, and I looked at it, and I looked at it. The one critical thing that I didn't understand was that Jesus was my substitute. I had a performative faith. That meant I was saved as long as I did all the right things, had the right thoughts, uh, didn't say a cuss word 24 hours before Sunday. That's kind of one silly example, but I mean, that's in the thinking. That, and my dad, who, I love my parents, but my dad, his big center of his life was the second coming of Jesus. And so a lot of times he would be preaching on the rapture and the second coming of Jesus. And I always doubted whether or not, if Jesus were to come tonight, this is the way they would close with the altar call. If Jesus were to come tonight, would you be ready? And I'd always say, oh, forgive me. Yes, now I'm ready, until the next time I stumbled. And then I wasn't ready. I did not understand the security of salvation in Christ. I did not understand that Jesus became my substitute. In one way, I didn't understand that he rewrote my history. So, as my substitute, his life, when I believed in him by faith, became my history. So, when God looks at me, he sees the history of Jesus, and my salvation is secure. I didn't understand that. And as I'm going through this test, I'm all of a sudden, these light bulbs are beginning to explode in my head. And I started weeping, and I wept for 3 days straight. I mean, it was a radical gut check experience. And at the end of it, I went to my wife and I said, I think Jerry's right. And she looked at me, she said, really? I said, I think he's right. And she goes, huh, well, then I'm in. And all of a sudden, she had it. It took me 3 days to get there, but she had it in 5 seconds. I mean, because she did not want to believe that her faith was performative. She wanted to believe that Jesus was her substitute too. And that completely changed our marriage, and it completely changed me, and it completely changed her. And we used to say a simple little thing, how do you become saved? By believing in Jesus. How do you stay saved? And that's where our background said, by not doing this, not doing this, not doing this, not doing, that's how you stay saved. And that's not it. You stay saved by believing in Jesus because you develop then a walk with him, and you're secure. You are totally secure. So I always say now that there are two great aspects of Christianity. And this is why this faith, because we have a living faith. The first aspect is the gospel, God's work for us in Jesus, justification. The second aspect is sanctification, God's work in us by the Holy Spirit. It's all God's work, and it's all for us and all in us. And it's not that we have to perform. We're not trained dogs trying to do something for the master. The master wants us to just love and serve him. And my faith is living because the Holy Spirit lives in me, and Christ was resurrected for me, and his history is mine. So, in a nutshell, and I don't know how long that took me, but that's basically my transformation. And every person that I've had the privilege of leading down that path have seen those same kind of radical transformations. It's just been amazing. And one more thing, I started a gospel podcast with a friend of mine who was in my youth group when I was in that same church where I had my discovery. And we do this gospel podcast as a live stream, and he does the music for me. And we had over 15,000 hits this last broadcast. And so I know that people are out there hungry for the gospel. I know my faith is not in government. My faith is not in the president. My faith is not in anything but Jesus. And I think people are really desperately looking for that. So anyway,
Well, put in
Um,
a good word for us, Wayne, with, on your gospel podcast. We'd be glad
oh, I
to
do.
be. Uh,
I
well,
do.
I was, I guess, born into the faith, and it was always a part of our lives when I was a young boy growing up. My English grandmother and her sisters were all members of the Friends. People call them Quakers, and it was a very
Yeah.
meditative and sort of a calming kind of faith. My mother's family was sort of German Calvinist. They came from an area of Bavaria called the Palatinate, and there was this kind of mashup German Calvinist faith that relied a lot upon sort of intellect and intellectual discipline. Uh, my dad's family were Scots. They were Scots Presbyterians, and in fact, some of the lineage in my dad's line had been Scots Presbyterian ministers. So, as a kid, I grew up, and it all made sense to me because these were intelligent people. Of course, they were people that I loved, and they cared for me. But there was an intellectuality to the understanding, and it made sense that God was in heaven and everything was under. And then the Beatles came down the road. And of course, like my generation, I was absolutely taken by them. And when they started into meeting with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and getting into transcendental meditation, that was something that I absolutely had to do. And so I did. I got into TM, and that launched a journey that went on for a number of years. I ended up, studying the Rig Veda and the Bhagavad Gita and read the Upanishads, and that somehow led into an understanding of Buddhism and Zen, and then Taoism or Taoism, which is something that I still have an absolute respect and admiration for, and I still read sort of Taoist philosophy from time to time. Confucianism, Zoroastrianism. I was like a sponge, and it was a time of my life when I could, buy books and spend time reading and studying. Baha'u'llah, Richard Alpert, who became Baba Ram Dass,
Mm.
and that led me then into the Christian mystics. And so I spent a lot of time trying to absorb this particular experience because I started off as thinking that I was a believer in Jesus. And I was looking at the faith now with sort of a new set of eyes and really a new lens. And I came back after all of this to see Jesus in a new light. It was no longer a kind of superhero or savior. I first of all absorbed sort of the enormity of his human life, his humanity, and without really knowing how and all of this happened, but there was a development phase in his life where he also had to develop his own spirituality, his own faith, even though fully human, fully God. Um, and I began to think of him at that point in my life as a kind of spiritual master, sort of an avatar in this cosmos where there are forces of light and forces of darkness. And so I was looking at him as a rabbi, an itinerant rabbi, someone who, took on the power structure of his faith and the power structure at the time, spoke a very simple faith to people, but at the same time connected with this element of our existence that I did not understand, the deep mystery, the full mystery, the empowerment of God, the creation of all of this. And that was a time that we were now starting to have children, and I wanted to make sure that they were brought up in faith. And so we reconnected with Presbyterian Church, where the pastor at the time, the interim pastor, had been my high school pastor. And he was probably one of the people that I have the greatest admiration and respect for in my life, Howard Stone, McCormick Theology Seminary, and had been a leader of a lot of civil rights organizations and groups, and a man who had certainly struggles in his own family and his own life, but he was this saintly kind of power. When we were in high school, he had a group called Pastor's Study, and the high school kids would go in there. And of course, at the time, we were trying to challenge him, trying to throw him off, trying to embarrass him, trying to ask him questions he couldn't answer. He was unflappable, absolutely unflappable. He had this deep and abiding grace and this way of understanding us and this connectivity. And so that put me back into what I guess was my maybe DNA pre-selection of Presbyterianism, because of the Scots heritage and the German Calvinism, and so I started into some very active church service for many years, and I was part of what was called a theological roundtable. The church that I was affiliated with, when we joined, had 2,500 members. It was over 4,000 when we left Indiana and came to California. They had a huge staff. I think there were 35 or 36 on staff, and 20, 21, 22 of those were all advanced degree people. And so this theological roundtable was essentially for the staff and the church leadership. And we met every week for 2 hours over lunch. And we read theology, and we discussed it. And I was, hanging on for dear life. I mean, fingernails on the table trying to understand what they were talking about. But after about 15, 16 years, I absorbed a great deal. During that period of time, I was part of a weekly luncheon meeting with the Indianapolis Hebrew congregation. They were members of our denomination and the rabbi from the Indianapolis Hebrew congregation. And we spent 5 years every week. And I began to develop a sense of the backstory of Jesus and the faith from which he derived, and sort of the tradition of all of that. I was stuck. I had sort of dabbled previously with Kabbalah, and I got to know Rabbi Eric Brom. And Eric said, this is deep stuff. It's serious stuff. It's not something for dilettantes. But there are a couple of books if you really want to read about it. And I don't profess to understand any of it. But in the context of these groups and senior minds and people who had devoted their lives to the study of and the service of Christ, it added a lot of my understanding from what was, I look back at now as sort of a naive understanding, but it gave me a chance for a journey. So why this faith, in a practical sense, because I spent most of my life as a journalist, it's sort of it's our best chance. It's our only hope.
Right.
Us as individuals and as people on this planet. Why? And because I think ultimately it's about love. And love may well be the highest human aspiration, the highest human act, and the goal to which we should all sort of try to reach. And it's a decision we make about how we live with each other, and how we live with ourselves. It's my sense that this Christian faith, this study and this devotion to the life of Jesus, awakens something in us. It arouses something in us. Somehow, mystically, maybe it stimulates something in us. It's in speaking figuratively, it's as though it reaches a molecule, or it touches a link. It connects with something in us. And the more time that we're on that vibration, or the more time that our mind is involved in that, and our heart and soul is sort of resonating inside this relationship, we continue to be transformed and transcended. We continue to grow. It's like an athlete or a pianist that practice, just simply putting our minds and our hearts in the presence of Christ and study and devotion to changes us. And I think it changes us over the course of life. It maybe is what transformation and transcendence happens too. And then ultimately we find a kind of comfort in this as well. Maybe that's a personal takeaway, and maybe it's not, theologically correct. But I think the more time we spend in the presence of Christ,
Sure.
the better we feel
Yep.
about everything. And I think the more we can endure, the more that we can find ways of trying to be a mitigating influence in this life, and ultimately we can stand next to a mystery. I'm one of those people that I'm very pragmatic, and I like to understand things, and so I'm always questioning and always sort of trying to get to, well, now, how can that be? Why is that? But I think the more time that we spend and sort of try to dwell in the presence of Christ, that the mystery is there, and it's just part of it. It's just maybe part of the beauty.
Yeah.
It's just part of the beauty of it. And so that is how, as a layman, I've sort of navigated my life, and why I find myself at this age in life, active in the church again. When I had retired and came from Indianapolis, California, I was through with being on boards and being involved in organizations, serving in the church, and on and on and on. And then I got drawn back in. and I think it's an inevitability. It's that DNA coding or something of the Scots Presbyterians. So let me come back to something that both of you have alluded to and talked about, and that is there a sense of call on our lives, whether we recognize it as call, or we recognize it as a curiosity, but are some people, and I don't want to get too Calvinistic about this, but are some people sort of drawn, pulled in, given an assignment? Their lives are just sort of flowing in a way that you're going to stand next to this, and you're going to stand in this, and you're going to be there, and you're going to do this for people. Is that something that is beyond our own intellectuality and our own sort of self-importance and intellectual process of deciding how and what we're going to do with our lives? Is this part of the mystical touch? By the way, Eugenia, I absolutely love the mystics and find, so I'm asking, I guess, a question that has a little bit of shading of mysticism. And are we somehow called into this?
Well, can I speak now, or do we have to kind of?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I know that. I mean, my belief is that we are, each of us, called into this extraordinary life with God. Now, some of us wake up to that call earlier than others of us. I have seen people in the 45 years of my ministry, I've seen people wake up to Jesus on their deathbed. But I also know that something began to happen in me when I was 2.5 years old, if not before that. And that sense of when I think of call, I think that, I think of the Westminster Catechism, that the chief purpose of a human being is to love God and enjoy God forever. I think we all, every creature, I would go so far as to say, on this planet has that deeply embedded calling. It is in the soul. It is in our nephesh. It is there for us to answer. Now, some of us have a more specialized kind of calling, a more specialized way that we're invited to walk our faith out. One of the things I've always loved is the early churches describing themselves as people of the way, or people of the walk, people of the path. That really resonates with me, because my journey is a path. But my calling into ministry, that was a Damascus Road moment for me. I had just graduated from University of Alabama in 1976 with my degree in poetry and short story writing, creative writing. I was working as a waitress at Joe Namath's restaurant in Tuscaloosa, and as a hostess at the yacht club in the evenings, and writing poetry on the back of gum wrappers, and dreaming of going to New York and living over a delicatessen and wearing gloves with the fingers out and freezing and being a writer and stuff. Well, one night I was still there's never been a time when I've not been active in a congregation, and I was active in my congregation even all through college. But I remember I had gone to visit my cousin Arthur the summer after I graduated. He had just finished his first year of law school at University of Iowa, and I'd gone to visit Arthur, and the task that the family had given him was that he was to talk me into going to law school. That was the family business. All this writing stuff was cute, but nobody was going to ever marry me, so I needed to earn a living. And so that was the thing. So I went out with a bunch of his friends to this bar in Des Moines called the Duck Blind. And we stayed out for quite some period of time and got home in the wee hours of the morning. And we were sitting out on the front steps of his house, and he made the pitch one more time about going to law school. And I said, it's not me. I don't want to be a lawyer. And he said, well, what do you want to do? And the thought had never hit me before. I had never conceptualized it before. But out of my mouth came the words, I want to be a pastor. I had never seen a woman pastor. I had never heard a woman preach. And it scared me so badly that the next day, I was just grateful that Arthur had been preaching to the wind and didn't remember a thing about it. But for 6 months, God woke me up. And it was at 3 o'clock in the morning, every morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, God would wake me up. I hadn't been home long from, my job as a hostess at the yacht club, and God would wake me up, and there was just this sense of restlessness. And I would wake up saying, I can't do that. I can't do that. And then one night in particular, I woke up and it was clear to me, I didn't get an auditory, but it was clear to me that God wanted me to go to seminary and become a pastor. And I remember my response was, there's no way I can do that, because I'd never get to wear my little black strapless cocktail dress again, and it's not even paid for. And yet there was almost like a literal light that came on in the room. And the next day, I girded up my loins and went to see my pastor. And I said, look, this is what has been happening to me. And this is what I feel like God is asking me to do. And he said, well, Eugenia, I'm glad you made this appointment. I've been wondering when you were going to get around to it. And so there was this sense of, a providential moving of my life through all of the experiences of my life to put me in the place, where God wanted me to serve. But it sure doesn't have to be any kind of pastoral ministry. I think I was called to pastoral ministry to save myself. It was what I had to do. It was what I needed. We always teach what we most need to learn. It was where I could be whole, and hopefully God could use me for the benefit of others. And I think I think our calling is always to the path that leads to our wholeness, or Wick's word, transformation, that daily transformation, regeneration, resurrection. All of those words, whatever that path may be, that's the one that by hook and by crook, the Spirit will eventually put us on.
What kind of what kind of trail? Were there times that you wondered why you were doing this, if it was the right thing? You affirmed that you were or not?
What Eugenia just said is exactly the same type of thing I went through, even though I was in professional ministry at the time. I was getting paid to be a youth pastor, but I was going through the steps, and I was saying all the right words, but the spirit wasn't in it. And then you could say, well, God used a donkey in the Old Testament. He was probably using you.
Exactly.
But, but
You know, I
go,
just have to
go
jump
ahead.
in there, Wink,
Yeah.
because I think that those moments when we are going through the motions, or those moments when it doesn't feel real anymore, or when we're so challenged, or when it just hasn't clicked yet, I absolutely believe that those are necessary moments. I don't think they're a failing on our part. I think they are a part of the path that we have to traverse for our joy to be complete, and for
Right.
us to learn whatever it is that will bring our healing most fully.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, let me share just a couple stories. I don't want to make a long story longer, but Dr. Michael, good friend of mine, Johns Hopkins clinical psychologist. Okay. This guy is ascending to the peaks. All he has to do is publish a few books. He never has to work again in his life, right? And he's sitting in his office. He grew up Mennonite. And he's sitting in his office, and this is the way he describes it. And Jesus shows up. And I was undone for 4 hours. He said 4 hours came and went, and all I did was weep. And I didn't know what time it was. I just knew that I had to follow Jesus. And he calls his supervisor. I mean, this guy is right at the top. He calls his supervisor, says, I'm resigning. And he says, why? Well, his supervisor says, are you nuts? Say that to a psychologist.
yeah.
Yeah.
Are you nuts? you know, uh, and he says, no, I met Jesus and I have to follow him. I just have to follow him. And he walked out of his office. That was it. I told you the story of Mary, Islamic woman living in Tehran. She wakes up in the middle of the night and she sees Jesus at the foot of her bed. You know, she finds out through a series of talking with other people. You can get killed in Tehran for being a Christ follower, for having a Farsi Bible. She tells her husband she met Jesus. He turns her over to the authorities and she runs with her two kids to Canada. That's where I met her because they were going to put her in jail. And I said, Mary, why did you do that? She said, I couldn't help myself. I have to tell somebody that I met Jesus. I saw him. I have to tell. I had another kid in one of my youth groups. He's a drug addict, heroin addict. He's always borrowing needles and spoons and lighters from everyone else. He finally gets his own, what they call a set of works, needle, spoon, lighter. And he goes to shoot up his first time with his own works, and Jesus shows up. And he puts the stuff away. He comes to the church. I had met him. I had talked to him a few times. He comes to the church. He puts it down on the altar, this little bag with all of his stuff in it. He says, I met Jesus. I don't want this anymore. He says, you know what? Wink, the thing that makes me the maddest is I finally got my own set of works and now I don't even need it. But I mean,
Oh,
this
wow.
is this radical transformation
Mhm.
that, and I can't explain if God calls everyone. I mean, there are people that say, "Oh, God calls everyone," and you just have to be obedient to the call. And then there are other people that says God picks. I don't know. I know with me, all of a sudden, I once was blind, now I see, and it's been that way for
Mhm.
so many other people.
Mhm.
And it's a faith. It is a faith that is so living in me that I can't deny it's not real, you
Right.
know? And it,
Well,
you know,
I, I, I really like that point about this living faith that you've made today, Wink. I back back during the Vietnam War, when I was getting ready to go to school and trying to decide career path, I had sometimes a curiosity about maybe I should study theology.
mhm,
Pastors had always been in our house. My dad was active in, on the board of elders and the board of trustees, the superintendent of Sunday school, and the churches we had been. And I kind of admired these people, but I thought, yeah, I don't know. I know myself too well to think that I could be a minister, a pastor. These are people that are special. Well, as I'm sort of wrestling with this, now we're draft bait for the Vietnam War.
right.
My father was a combat veteran in the infantry in the South Pacific. He had been a drill instructor and was a very patriotic man. But he and I, in our conversations, there were sort of two seminal moments. We watched the civil rights movement play out on television.
Mhm.
We watched what happened in the South, in your home
My
state,
front yard.
Eugenia,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Mm,
and I was taken at that time by the role of the journalist, the people who were there with cameras and notepads to tell the story, because had they not been there, all of this would have happened and it would have been unnoticed.
mm,
I had played with the idea of getting a commission through ROTC, spending my time in the service, and then going to work in foreign service. So all of this is sort of swirling around, and I am considering: am I a conscientious objector? Because I thought war was wrong, and I still do, and I thought war is sort of kind of crucifixion, that it's evil and it's a failure
mhm.
of everything human, and and so I went to my pastor Howard and I talked about, am I a conscientious objector? And he says, you might be, you might be, and we talked, but I never took that path because I felt, there may be a bit of cowardice in me. I don't want to go. I don't want to be engaged in the military, and I don't want to suffer harm. But but there may be a way that I could provide a kind of service, and that's how I tracked into journalism. And so this living faith, I'm coming back to the
Mhm.
point. There were times in, my nearly 50 years of being at some of humanity's worst moments, extreme poverty and devastation and lives shattered and broken, where you would you would see the presence of Christ in people who were there, uh, either picking up pieces or those who were trying to help them pick up pieces. Uh,
Mm,
People who were crying for guidance and those who were there to provide the guidance. And I saw this faith as a living pact between those of us who are in this life and the enabling power and the guiding power of Christ.
mm,
And I thought that, well, the least I can do is to report about
mhm,
it, to talk about it, to
mhm,
share it, and to share it with other people. And so I felt, in a sense, that I spent those years in a kind of call, in
Mhm.
in in
mhm.
a in, in
Oh,
a in a
definitely.
kind
Yeah.
of in a kind of ministry. And so I think there are a lot of us who are, laymen, who are civilians, not like you guys who are, trained professional clergy, that also feel this. And I'm wondering if the direction of faith groups and faith units will not have to rely more upon. I hasten, or I don't want to use the word. I'm really hesitant to use the word enlightened, but there are people who I think have seen the light or have felt the light, who may not have had the professional training, but at the same time, Lord, help us if we don't have people who have devoted their lives to the professional study of the faith and the theology. And that brings us to what we may talk about the next time we gather, because we're sort of running out of time today. I wanted to make that and use that as a little bit of a cliffhanger, because I think that while we took time off last year during the election campaign and the political season, that we are coming back around now, living in a new reality. And I think faith in our lives and how we deal with that as citizens is also important. And that brings us to people who have studied and people who have experience, and not people who use the faith for particular reasons. And so, time for final thoughts and summary comments before we close this out. Wink?
Oh, summary comment. Well, the only summary I have is Jesus is my history. and as a result, the Holy Spirit lives within me, and it leads me on his path. It's my connection with the Godhead, and I don't know any other life. And both my wife and I are very comfortable getting closer and closer to the other side of that veil, if we can say it that way, because of this faith that's in us. So, if anybody's watching this that doesn't have that, you can have it. Just trust
Call
in
us on the
Christ.
phone. We will talk.
Yeah, give us a call. We'll walk you through. I'll put you up, Eugenia. Go ahead.
Well, I think I don't know if it's a summary as much as an observation that is so wonderful to me about this time together. And you asked the question, why this faith? And what I've noticed is that there are both points of connection and points of departure in each of our three experiences of the living God in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I value so much about the faith is that it is exercised in community, where there are stories shared and different voices heard. And my trust is that in that conversation, holy things take place. I think that's what happens in worship. Even though I do most of the blathering on, there's still this conversation that takes place in the community of faith. I think that when we try to walk the walk just on our own, even if we do have an experiential faith with God, we are always in danger of confusing the voice of our ego with the voice of God. And when we are in conversation with one another, when we enter into the disciplines of community and responsibility for community, for the broader community, so that we live with integrity in it, then I think we're on even more solid ground for loving the world in Jesus' name.
That's right.
Well,
Agreed.
in the last decade or so that we have been together in this safe harbor community, I would say that certainly my faith has been buoyed and enhanced by you, and Wink, by you as well. It is I think this idea of community is so important, and that may be what we have to hang on to in these next few years, is this sense of community. And as we say, what we're trying to do in these conversations is tell stories this year and engage heart, mind, and soul. And I think that's sort of the triad that we're sort of operating from. And I thank you for your sharing, for your thoughts, for your hearts, and your soul time today. And for those of you who are watching or listening, we thank you very much for your attention as well. And God bless you all. And there's more to talk about, and we will get to it the next time. Thank you for joining us on Safe Harbor Conversations.
Thanks.
Safe Harbor Conversations, engaging heart, mind, and soul. Our conversation topic today, why this faith? Our conversationalists are Reverend Eugenia Gamble, pastor and author, Wink Farron, pastor, social media shepherd, and life coach. And I'm Tom Cochran, a journalist, analyst, and a Presbyterian elder. These are challenging times for people of faith, for churches, organized religion, faith groups. Seems to be a very acrimonious time. Membership is declining in a lot of denominations around the world. It appears as though some would seek to hijack Christian faith and turn it into a political tool. There is a rise in the nones and dones, those who have no faith affiliation or say they do not, or have been active and no longer are. So we're going to try and unpack some of that today by looking at our interpretation of this faith we follow, the Christian faith. Why this faith? We're glad that you're along for this conversation. Let's start with Eugenia Gamble. Eugenia, why this faith?
Yeah, I didn't want to go first, but I will because I'm happy to talk about my faith. My faith is the center of my life, and it has been as long as I can remember. My earliest memory, my entire earliest memory, when I was 2.5 years old, is a deeply spiritual memory. And it surrounded the death of my grandmother. My grandmother and I were very close to each other, and she died from out of control diabetes. And in those days, and this would have been in the 50s, and in those days in Alabama, many of the funerals were held from home. And that the family decided that that's how we would do my grandmother's funeral. And it was also decided that I was too young to stay for that. There was going to be the casket brought in front of the fireplace in the living room just behind me. And they thought that, and it would be open. And so they thought that would be, that I was not ready for that. And so I was taken